In 1964, one drum company controlled 70% of the American market. Their logo appeared on the most watched television broadcast in history. Their shells were played by the most recorded drummers of the 20th century. Their factory ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, and still could not keep pace with demand. 12 years later, it was over. Not because of fraud, not because a competitor built something better, because of something harder to see and far more instructive. This is what the peak looked like, and what was already ending inside it. Chapter 1. A $4 drum changed everything. Chicago, 1887. Late autumn. The streets of the North Side smell like coal smoke and horse manure, and the particular cold of a city built too close to a lake. A boy named William Ludwig is 8 years old. His father is German. His shoes are worn through at the left heel. The family's plan for him involves violin lessons, the kind of investment that working-class immigrant families make when they understand correctly that music is a path toward a respectability that physical labor will not provide. William attends the lessons. He learns almost nothing. What he cannot stop thinking about is a marching band he encountered one afternoon on a Chicago street. Not the brass, not the uniforms, not the pomp of it, but the drummer. The way one man with 2 sticks and a suspended shell controlled the entire forward momentum of 200 people. The way rhythm in the right hands was not accompaniment. It was architecture. He went home and confessed to his father that he'd been skipping practice. In exchange for a promise to study harder, then Heinrich Ludwig agreed to buy his son a drum. It cost $4. William became a working drummer. Circuses, vaudeville tours, pit orchestras for plays that closed after 2 nights. Not celebrated, not well paid, but close enough to the instruments of his era to understand from the inside what they consistently failed to do. The bass drum required 2 people to operate properly, or a contortion of the body that left a player exhausted by the second act. The pedal mechanisms that existed were imprecise. They failed mid-performance. They failed in front of audiences, in the middle of songs, with no margin for recovery and no time for apology. He was not a visionary. He was a craftsman who had spent years living inside a specific, painful problem, and who could feel the gap between what the instrument was and what it needed to be every time he sat down behind one. That combination, technical frustration, mechanical aptitude, and the economic pressure of irregular work, would prove to be the exact conditions from which an empire grew. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever watched something excellent collapse under the weight of its own success, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly that kind of story. Hit the button now before we go further. What comes next is worth staying for. Chapter 2. 1 foot, 1 pedal, 1 solution. In 1909, William and his brother Theobald opened a drum shop at 204 Randolph Street in Chicago. The storefront was narrow, the inventory was modest, but it was built, from its first day, around one specific innovation they believed in completely: a bass drum pedal that a single drummer could operate with 1 foot. And it sounds modest. It was not. William had built the first prototype himself on his kitchen table, with hand tools and salvaged hardware and the accumulated memory of every performance where the mechanism had failed him. He tested it against his own body, his foot, his fatigue, the angle of his ankle after 2 hours in a theater pit. He knew which tolerances mattered because he had spent a career feeling the ones that didn't. The pedal was not a theoretical invention. It was a physical answer to a physical problem, designed by the only kind of person who could have designed it correctly. Someone who had felt the problem from the inside and had no patience left for half measures. Orders came from orchestral players, theatre musicians, military bandmasters. By 1917, the United States Army had contracted Ludwig and Ludwig to supply rope-tensioned snare drums, the instrument that kept time for an entire war effort. This was not a marketing victory. It was an engineering victory made possible only because the founder had lived inside the problem first. That embodied knowledge would be, for half a century, an advantage almost no competitor could replicate. And it would be, in the end, the ceiling above which the company could not adapt. Chapter 3. Drummers built this, not businessmen. To understand what made Ludwig genuinely different, you have to understand a single technical concept: the bearing edge. Run your finger along the top rim of a well-made drum, and you feel a clean, consistent bevel, sharp enough to seat the head without dampening it, angled precisely enough that the head vibrates freely all the way to the fundamental tone. Too shallow, and the drum sounds dead. Too steep, and it rings without focus. The difference, to an untrained hand, is almost imperceptible. To a player who has spent years behind a drum kit, it is everything. Getting it right is not a matter of following a specification. It is a matter of having played enough drums to hear the difference, and having cared enough for long enough to fix it. Ludwig got it right, consistently, because the men running the factory floor were not businessmen who had acquired a drum company. They were drummers who had built one, and they could hear a poorly made shell the moment they sat down behind it. By 1923, the factory employed 240 people and held the position of largest drum manufacturer in the world. Not through discounting, not through aggressive distribution, through a craft superiority built from the inside out by people whose hands were the most sensitive quality control instruments in the building. The weakness embedded in that advantage was invisible from inside it. It depended entirely on those conditions remaining intact: a particular place, a particular workforce, a particular relationship between the people on the floor and the instruments they were making. They would not remain intact forever. Chapter 4. 3 layers, one unbeatable system. By the 1950s, Ludwig had constructed something more durable than a factory. It had constructed a system, and it had 3 interlocking layers. The first was the building itself. 1728 North Darman Avenue, Wicker Park, Chicago's North Side. Walk through the front door, and you heard the shell presses running before you saw them, a low, rhythmic thud that moved through the floor and up through your feet. Ludwig manufactured its shells, its hardware, its pedal mechanisms, its vinyl wraps, all under one roof. 300 workers, 3 shifts, 6 days a week. Quality was never subcontracted, never handed to a supplier who didn't understand what they were making. The second layer was the artist relationship. As early as 1947, Ludwig placed Buddy Rich, the most technically demanding drummer in American music, a man known to stop a performance mid-song over an instrument that failed him, on the cover of its catalog. Lionel Hampton followed, Gene Krupa, Frankie Carlson. When the musician with the highest standards in the world chooses your drum and puts his name to that choice, the credibility transfer is absolute. Every young drummer who opened that catalog understood something without being told. The third layer was the schools. Students in high school band programs and university percussion departments across the United States were learning on Ludwigs. They were not just acquiring technique, they were acquiring a preference seated in muscle memory at the most formative period of their musical development, before they had any reason to question it. A student who learned on a Ludwig at 15 did not choose Ludwig when they became a professional. They assumed it. Artists authenticated the product. Schools distributed the experience. The factory delivered the quality that made both credible. And the whole structure rested every day on the machinery running inside 1728 North Darman Avenue. Chapter 5. The Night 73 Million Watched. February 9th, 1964. A Sunday evening. New York City. 73 million Americans turned on their televisions. That number, 73 million, in a country of 192 million, is worth sitting with for a moment. There was no streaming, no algorithm, no second screen. There was one broadcast, and most of the country was watching it together, in living rooms that smelled like Sunday dinner, on sets with rabbit ears, and the particular grey-blue light of a cathode tube. The Ed Sullivan Show. 4 young men from Liverpool. An energy that felt physically different from anything American audiences had encountered in a television studio before. Louder, faster, more alive than the medium seemed designed to contain. Ringo Starr sat behind a Ludwig downbeat kit finished in black oyster pearl. The bass drum head faced the camera at a slight angle, the Ludwig logo centered in the frame for the duration of every performance. It was not a paid arrangement. It was not product placement. It was simply where the logo was, and 73 million people saw it for the length of every song. The next morning, the phone at 1728 North Darman Avenue began ringing. It did not stop for 3.5 years. Sales climbed from $6.1 million in 1963 to $13.1 million in 1965. A second shift was added, then a third. The building expanded by 100,000 square feet. Workers came in on holidays. Some came in on Christmas morning and found the machines already running. The ticker tape machine that printed overnight orders, positioned just inside the main office beside the front window, unspooled paper across the floor each night, dense with demand, sometimes trailing down the hall to the staircase. Management arrived each morning and measured success in feet of paper. The Supraphonic 400 snare drum, introduced that same year, would become, by the consensus of recording engineers, session musicians, and 3 subsequent decades of historical documentation, the most recorded snare drum in the history of the medium. The crack of it is on more records than any other single piece of acoustic percussion ever manufactured. John Bonham chose Ludwig, Keith Moon, Ginger Baker, Carl Palmer, every major recording of a decade that defined what popular music sounded like. By the early 1970s, Ludwig held an estimated 70% of the American drum market. The company had not simply won a competition, it had become the default, the word people used when they thought about drums at all. It was the peak, and inside the peak, invisible and already compounding, the conditions that would end it were forming. Chapter 6. 3 Forces, None Arriving Separately. In 1972, a man named Raymond Kowalski retired after 26 years on Ludwig's shell press line. He knew that machine the way a surgeon knows a particular set of instruments. Its resistances, its rhythms, the quarter-turn adjustment you made on Tuesday mornings when the overnight temperature had dropped and the metal had contracted in the cold. That knowledge had taken years to accumulate. It lived entirely in his hands and his memory. He trained the man who replaced him. Some things transferred, some did not. Raymond was not the last. He was the first of many. The Wicker Park neighborhood that had sustained the factory's labor ecosystem for 60 years was dispersing. To the suburbs, to other industries, to cities where the economics were more forgiving. Union contracts were now calibrated to Chicago's rising cost of living, not to what it cost to make drums competitively in a global market. The building's electrical infrastructure and floor-mounted machinery had been running 3 shifts since the Beatles broadcast and needed updating that had been deferred year after year, because there was never a window to shut a line down long enough to fix it. Roland Corporation released a programmable drum machine in 1978. The TR-808 followed in 1980, a subsonic thud that moved through the floor of a club before you consciously heard it, at a price accessible to a producer working alone in a bedroom. Yamaha introduced a commercially viable electronic drum kit in the early 1980s. Consistent, silent enough for an apartment, maintenance-free, with no bearing edges to worry about. A teenager in 1982 who wanted to make music needed a machine the size of a shoebox and a power outlet. The generation that had watched Ringo behind that Black Oyster Pearl kit in 1964 was 35 now. The generation behind them had grown up with synthesizers and drum machines. The acoustic drum kit, for many of them, was not the sound of modern music. It was the sound of their parents' music. 3 forces, none of them individually sufficient, all 3 converging. And inside 1728 North Darman Avenue, no single person had a complete picture of all 3 at once. Chapter 7. The pull rate nobody connected. There was a man in Ludwig's quality control department, his name does not appear in the historical record, who had been pulling finished snare drums off the line and testing them since 1961. He knew the correct weight of a shell in his hands before he struck it. He knew by the sound of the first stroke whether the bearing edge had held. Around 1977, he started pulling more drums, not dramatically more, not enough to trigger a formal review, enough that he noticed and mentioned it once to his foreman, who filed it somewhere and said nothing further. The machinery was aging. The tolerances it could maintain were narrowing. The shells were still Ludwig shells, but still better than most of what the competition was producing. But they required more correction at the finishing stage than they had 5 years earlier. In music stores from Cleveland to Phoenix, Japanese-made drum kits were appearing on the floor beside the Ludwigs, cheaper. At first, noticeably inferior. The shells thinner, the hardware rougher, the bearing edges inconsistent. But each year they improved. The gap narrowed. A 17-year-old who had not yet formed a brand loyalty was not buying history. He was buying what was on the floor, at the price he could afford, and asking his teacher whether it was good enough. It was getting good enough. By 1980, the pull rate in Ludwig's quality control department was no longer a footnote. It was a trend. And the ticker tape machine that had once trailed orders down the hallway was printing a little less paper each month. Chapter 8. The Knowledge That Could Not Move. On November 4th, 1981, William F. Ludwig II sat down and signed the papers. He was 65 years old. He had spent his entire adult life inside this company, inside this building, inside this single industry. His father had started it. He had run it. He knew every floor of 1728 North Darman Avenue the way you know a house you grew up in, which stairs creaked, which presses ran loud, which foreman you called first when a line went down at 2 a.m. There was no successor within the family. The company faced capital demands a family-owned operation at his stage of life could not finance independently. He sold Ludwig to the Selma Company of Elkhart, Indiana. A Selma was experienced, financially stable, capable of sustaining the brand. What it could not possess, what no acquiring entity could possess through any mechanism of due diligence, was the institutional relationship to the product that had defined Ludwig's quality for 7 decades. Selma made instruments. It did not make drums. The distinction mattered more than the acquisition documents could account for. Selma's analysts saw what the financials showed: an aging facility in a deteriorating neighborhood with rising labor costs and a capital deficit. They looked at their plant in Monroe, North Carolina, updated, cost-effective, skilled labor, favorable economics, and the relocation decision wrote itself. By every financial metric available, it was defensible. What it could not account for was the degree to which the quality of a Ludwig drum was not a function of the shell press, or the tooling, or the catalog, or the brand name on the bass drum head. It was a function of the people who ran the machines. Raymond Kowalski's quarter turn on Tuesday mornings. The quality control man's hands. Decades of small, undocumented corrections made by people who cared because they understood what they were making. The machinery could be crated. The tooling could be loaded onto trucks. The trademarks, the contracts, the artist endorsements, all transferable through a legal document. The knowledge could not. It would walk out of 1728 North Darman Avenue for the last time in 1984. And it would not walk to Monroe. It would walk into a city that no longer had a drum factory and scatter and be gone. Chapter 9. The machine was silent. Roll empty. The sequence that followed unfolded with the procedural clarity of a decision already made. 1982. Selma commissions a facility assessment. Every finding is unfavorable. Infrastructure age, neighborhood conditions, labor cost trajectory, the capital required to bring the building to competitive standard. The report confirms what the logic had already concluded. 1983, Monroe, North Carolina. The relocation is finalized. 1984, Ludwig's 75th anniversary year. In a building that had been making drums since 1909, the shell presses run for the last time. The finishing lines shut down. The vinyl wrap stations go quiet. The floor, which for 20 years had never been fully still, holds the silence of a place that has stopped. 300 workers receive their notices, and most of them have nowhere specific to go. Paul Schmidt, who would later write the definitive history of the company, visited the building during the clearance. William Ludwig II walked him through the nearly vacant offices, the desks emptied, the walls bare, the rooms carrying the particular echo of spaces where everything has been removed. At one point, Ludwig stopped at the ticker tape machine, the device that had printed incoming orders through the overnight hours. He described the ritual of arriving each morning during the peak years to find the paper roll unspooled across the floor, sometimes trailing all the way down the hall to the staircase. He had stood in this room and watched it run, night after night, for years. Standing in the room now, he pointed to it. The machine was silent. The roll was empty. The empire had not fallen in a single decisive moment. It had reached the end of a long, quiet erosion, a compound consequence of forces building for more than a decade before the closure. What appeared from the outside as a sudden ending was the final visible symptom of a condition that had been present far longer, the last entry in a ledger that had been accumulating losses no balance sheet could see. Chapter 10. 300 workers, nowhere to go. The 300 workers at 1728 North Darman Avenue were not offered relocation to Monroe. They were released. Their skills were not general manufacturing skills. They were specific, calibrated to Ludwig's processes, Ludwig's machinery, the particular tolerances of a production line they had spent years learning to read. For a man who had spent 15 years understanding how a shell press behaved across the seasons, how it ran in July, humidity versus January cold, that knowledge had no market outside the building where he had acquired it. Some of them found other manufacturing work. Some didn't. The knowledge dispersed with them quietly into a city that had no further use for it. In Monroe, a man named Don Taylor was working against the worst of the loss. Taylor was a 14-year veteran of the Monroe facility. As the equipment arrived from Chicago, he did something not in his job description and not asked of him. He quietly set aside jigs, fixtures, and templates he recognized as irreplaceable, physical objects whose dimensions encoded decades of manufacturing decisions, tools that contained, in their precise geometry, answers to questions no one had thought to write down. A jig that established the correct angle for a bearing edge cut. A template adjusted incrementally over 20 years of small corrections until it produced exactly what the building in Chicago had learned to expect. He preserved them on his own judgment because he understood that without them, Monroe would be guessing at what Chicago had known. It was an act of genuine institutional stewardship. It was, by the nature of what it was preserving, incomplete. Some of what walked out of 1728 North Darman Avenue in the winter of 1984 could not be set aside on a shelf. It had retired. It had dispersed. It was gone. The company moved forward. The workers, the neighborhood, and the particular form of craft knowledge assembled at that address over 60 years did not. Chapter 11. The name survived. The system didn't. The Ludwig Drum Company continues to operate. Its facility in Monroe, North Carolina, produces more than 300 drum kit shells and 700 snare drums per month. Ringo Starr's instruments are made there. The black oyster pearl finish remains, more than 60 years after Ed Sullivan, the company's best-selling color. The name is on the bass drum head, exactly where it has always been. The collector market for pre-1984 Chicago-era Ludwig drums is extensive and analytically sophisticated. A community of players and historians who can date a shell by its badge, identify a manufacturing year by the wrap seam, and distinguish a 1967 finish from a 1969 by a quality of luster that no current production can replicate. The instruments from the peak years command prices that reflect their status as things that cannot be made again. Ringo Starr's specific 1963 kit from the Ed Sullivan broadcast sold at auction in 2015 for $2.1 million. The building at 1728 North Darman Avenue is now residential, loft condominiums. The listing materials describe exposed brick and original wood beams as architectural features, the physical residue of 60 years of industrial production, repackaged as aesthetic value, marketed to people who will never know what happened there, or what the floor felt like when the presses ran. The name survives. The system that gave the name its meaning does not. What exists in Monroe is a genuine continuation, instruments of real quality, people who carry the tradition forward with care. But the particular configuration of knowledge, or place, and people that made those drums irreplaceable has not existed since the winter of 1984. And William Ludwig II, the 65-year-old man who signed the papers in 1981, who knew every floor of that building, who had stood in the office and watched the ticker tape run, he knew it was not the same thing. He knew it before he signed. He signed anyway, because he was 65 and there was no other way forward, and sometimes the only honest choice available is the one that arrives with grief already attached. Final section. Analysis. Why this was inevitable. The collapse of Ludwig's Chicago operation belongs to a class of organizational failure that repeats across industries and across generations, with enough regularity to constitute a pattern. It is the failure of craft-based enterprises to sustain their defining quality across the transition from the people who built the craft to the institutions that inherit it. Three things are true about what happened here. The first is that craft knowledge is not an asset in any sense that accounting can capture. When Selmer acquired Ludwig, the balance sheet showed tooling, real estate, trademarks, customer relationships. It could not, show what Raymond Kowalski knew about the shell press he had run for 26 years. It could not show what the quality control man felt in his hands when he picked up a drum that was right. That knowledge had no line item. It had no transfer mechanism. It was not neglected in the acquisition. It was invisible to the instruments being used to measure value. The instruments were not wrong. They were measuring the wrong things. The second is that 70% market share is not a fortress. It is a vulnerability. A company with 70% share has no room to grow within its existing category. And every innovation that alters the category's boundaries poses a threat that is structurally asymmetric. The innovator has everything to gain. The incumbent has everything to lose. The electronic drum machine didn't need to capture the professional market to damage Ludwig. It needed only to capture the entry-level market, the students, the beginners, the teenagers, who in a previous decade would have started acoustic and eventually upgraded. When that pipeline narrowed, the consequences for the company with 70% share were structurally more severe than they would have been for a company with 15. Dominance had removed the margin that smaller companies still had. The third is that the conditions that produce excellence are not the conditions that sustain scale. Ludwig's craft superiority emerged from a specific combination: a founding generation with embodied expertise, a neighborhood that supplied a particular kind of skilled labor, an institutional culture formed over decades in a particular place, between particular people. When the neighborhood changed, the labor ecosystem changed with it. When the founding generation retired, the embodied expertise diffused. When the company moved, the culture could not be crated and loaded onto trucks with the shell presses. The configuration that had produced the excellence was irreproducible once any one of its components changed. And by 1984, all three had changed simultaneously. No matter how dominant an organization becomes, if the conditions that produced its dominance erode faster than the organization can adapt, if the knowledge that defines its quality lives in human hands and not in any document or machine, if the weight of having built something exceptional makes it harder rather than easier to build something different, The outcome is not determined by any single decision. It is determined long before the decision is made. In the quality control reports that no one connected to the larger picture, in the retirements that took knowledge with them and left adjustment logs that said nothing, in the ticker tape machine running through the night, in an empty office, printing orders that would eventually stop coming. William Ludwig II stood in that office one last time and looked at the empty roll of paper. He had built what his father started. He had run it at its peak. He had watched it become the infrastructure of an entire century of rhythm. And he had signed it away because the alternative was worse, and because sometimes the weight of what you've built is the very thing that keeps you from seeing what's coming until it's too late to stop it. The ending was already written inside the peak. The only question was whether anyone would read it in time. Ludwig built the sound of a century. Then the century moved on. If you found something worth thinking about in that, share this with one person who would. And if you want to be here for the next story, subscribe. We cover the companies, the crafts, and the moments where excellence and inevitability meet. The next one is already in production. Thank you for watching.